Welcome back. We're so glad that you stuck around. I think you're going to be really glad that you stuck around to the end of the day, or if you're just tuning in now for just this session on ransomware and national security. What could be more timely? And this group is an unbelievable group of experts and patriots and really have remarkable insights to what's going on. So let's get right to it. Let me get through the introduction so you can hear from them. Moderating the panel is Travis LeBlanc, the chair of Cooley's cyber data privacy practice, and he prides himself on thriving amid the juxtaposition of cyber, technology, law, and business. What makes Travis a cyber expert is not just Travis's experience as chief of the FCC's Enforcement Bureau during the Obama administration, or as a lawyer in the California AG's office, where at the direction of then California AG Kamala Harris, launched California's statewide privacy enforcement and protection unit, as well as the California e-crime unit, or that he's one of the few people on the planet who has degrees from Yale, Princeton, Harvard, and Cambridge. Yes, all four. But it's also that the U.S. Senate just unanimously confirmed his nomination to the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which advises on and reviews the federal government's counterterrorism activities to safeguard privacy and civil liberties. I like to refer to Travis as the LeBron James of incident response, but that doesn't work. It should be the other way around. LeBron James is the Travis LeBlanc of the NBA. So welcome, Travis. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, John.
Next up is Ashden Fein. Ashden is a partner at Covington in Burling. And what makes Ashden a cyber expert is not just that he advises a broad range of corporate clients on cybersecurity and national security matters, including crisis management, IR, risk management, governance, government internal investigations, regulatory compliance. But it's also that Ashden served as a military intelligence officer and later as a lawyer in the JAG Corps, culminating as the chief of the criminal division for a command of 17,000 soldiers and as a legal advisor for an Army aviation organization deployed in Iraq, ultimately as the lead trial attorney in the prosecution of Private Chelsea Manning for the leak of WikiLeaks. Given the legions of foreign soldiers that wake up every day with the sole goal of infiltrating U.S. systems and the fog of war characteristics of a ransomware attack, a national security expert like Ashden has become essential in so many IR matters, and we're so grateful to have him with us today. Thanks for being here, Ashden. Welcome.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me here.
And next up is Brendan Catalan, a senior director at Ankura, specializing in threat intelligence and analytics, forensic analysis, malware reverse engineering, and cyber operation, the technologist of this group. What makes Brandon a cyber expert is not just his 15 years of studying the tactics, techniques, and procedures employed by advanced adversaries and his ability to handle sophisticated and advanced cyber investigations, but it's also that Brandon has focused his career on APT attacks, advanced persistent threats, and all incidents involving foreign state sponsored espionage. So his intelligence community assessments are globally recognized as critical reading, and he's presented his findings at several U.S. Department of Defense symposia. Welcome, Brendan. Can't wait to hear what you have to say today. And then finally is Ian Brekke, who is the hardest working man in show business right now. He is acting general counsel at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Talk about a high pressure job. DHS plays multiple roles regarding incident response, including measuring the threat of countries against the U.S., investigating data security incidents for purposes of national security. Ian, how much sleep do you get every night, Ian? Tell the truth.
Enough to be here.
Okay, well that's probably 2 to 3 hours. If anyone thinks government employees work less than law firm employees, I think Ian would disagree. Welcome, Ian. Thanks for keeping us safe. And thanks especially for helping to manage the national security threat amid the daily chaos of COVID-19 and helping us all understand the benefits of cooperating and working with DHS after an incident. This is tricky territory for IR lawyers. And I'm just so grateful that we have people like you in government. And it's just terrific that you could find time to be here. So welcome. Thanks, Ian. And Travis, take it away.
John, I know that many people come to the IR forums for the content of the panels, but I also know that I repeatedly come just so that I can hear your introductions because they are extremely flattering to every single one of us. And so on behalf of Ian and Brandon and Ashden, I want to thank you for the amount of time that you put in to those introductions and curating these panels for everyone. So thank you, John.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Travis LeBlanc from Cooley, and I'm very excited to have the opportunity to moderate this panel of real experts to tackle ransomware and national security. I also appreciate that this is the final panel of the day, and so we're all going to do our best to keep things lively so that we can all hopefully avoid a little bit of Zoom fatigue. I know that is real. We also have the honor of hosting the Acting General Counsel of DHS, who I'm very confident will help keep us honest as to the role of the federal government in ransomware attacks with a national security component to it. Our discussion is timely, as the line between when a ransomware attack does and does not implicate national security issues is blurring every day. Just last year, many would have said that attacks on private sector biotech companies did not implicate national security or were unlikely to do so. Now, few of us would say otherwise. And while election security has been a topic that many have focused on, it may be that the more prescient issue is how our state and local governments have become the top ransomware target, almost greater than all other targets combined. And we will also discuss how the past year has demonstrated how key supply chain attacks can be to disrupting crucial manufacturing, distribution, and other processes that can have sweeping impacts on the security of the nation. One important caveat, recognizing that other sessions have already dealt with OFAC's recent guidance on ransomware payments, we won't delve into that aspect of national security during our session. We've got a great group of panelists for you. I'm going to monitor the chats for any questions from the audience. Please feel free at any time to let us know if you have any questions. In the meantime, let's jump in. When many think of national security in the private sector, they typically envision matters involving the federal government. These certainly are important, but ransomware impacts a broad range of industries and organizations that could also impact national security, such as ransomware directed at municipal governments, or the defense industry, or our communications networks, or our critical infrastructure, and in the ongoing pandemic, COVID-19 researchers and manufacturers. Ashden, you regularly advise clients who have been victims of ransomware attacks that have national security implications. Obviously, we all have our typical IR playbooks. How should we alter them if the incident could impact national security, whether that be around safeguarding, notification, or preservation, or any other issues?
Well, thanks, Travis. So when I think about the intersection of ransomware specifically and national security, I immediately think of three common scenarios. The first is that ransomware that's found or executed on an organization that operates within the defense industrial base, aerospace, or intelligence communities. The second would be ransomware that is found on organizations that can impact national security, like you've already addressed, biotech firms, or just general healthcare industry participants like WannaCry did in 2017. And then the third and perhaps most obvious would be if the nation state actor utilizes ransomware for their nefarious activities, whether it's false flag or covering their activities by using ransomware. That said, I expect this answer, if we were to spend the entire session talking about how to refine, amplify incident response plans and playbooks for national security implications, actually would just reinforce the fundamentals that have already been discussed throughout the day, including the key feature of the best incident response plan is flexibility. In my experience, companies should be able to use their incident response plans to respond to a wide range of cybersecurity incidents, ranging from a single employee disclosing their credentials through phishing to a sophisticated ransomware attack that potentially impacts entire production system within the national security domain. So companies in regulated industries, and specifically those within the aerospace and defense industry, should really pay attention and focus on the various types of sector-specific requirements, notification, safeguarding, and basically uptime requirements that are levied against them. So if a ransomware or other type of cybersecurity incident occurs, they know upfront what those obligations are and can react appropriately while remaining focused on the protection of national security. So for example, within the defense industrial base, there's a 72-hour notification requirement to notify the Department of Defense when there's a cyber incident. Cyber incidents have a very broad definition that would include ransomware or even attempted execution of ransomware. So having a process in place to identify that risk and to react appropriately can be vital, first and foremost, to notify DoD, not just because it's a compliance obligation, but also because it allows the department to assess the impact of national security and offer help, whether or not the company wants the help, but offer the help nonetheless in order to secure networks and secure the data. And then ultimately, companies' incident response plans shouldn't necessarily need to change just because the incident could impact national security, but these plans should be flexible enough, as I mentioned a moment ago, to respond to incidents that may have those national security implications, even if that implication or the impact is not known at the beginning of the incident, which is often, as many of us know, the case. So like for one example, having procedures for contacting industry groups, law enforcement, and others within the same industry could be key to understanding the potential impact of a ransomware attack. And then also, if there is, or when there is a national security nexus or a potential nexus, be prepared for law enforcement and other agencies to have greater involvement and be prepared to know where the lines are on how much a organization wants to or must cooperate with those organizations as they respond.
Thank you for that background, Ashden. It really, really helpful. I know so many people, when they hear 72 hours, they immediately think GDPR in Europe. But it's good to remind folks that those obligations do exist in the United States. And frankly, in my view, even 72 hours is probably one should lean towards doing it faster if there really is a national security risk to the country, because the damages that could be done in that, in those each additional hour are quite serious. Let's change topics just a little. We heard earlier today about ransomware and healthcare organizations in another session. I'd like to now turn towards a topic that may dovetail with both healthcare and national security issues: the threat of ransomware to the pandemic response and recovery. As everyone knows, we remain in a global pandemic that is a national and global security issue. And one of the keys to successfully getting out of that is not only the development of a vaccine, but storage, distribution, tracking of dosage, and such. Ian, could you start us off on a discussion of some of the key considerations regarding how ransomware could impact these processes and what is being done about it? Others may be able to weigh in on observations or thoughts on the impact of ransomware on the pandemic or pandemic response related organizations as well.
Yeah, thanks, Travis. I'd be happy to start us off. I'm happy to provide the DHS perspective because we've been really involved in the pandemic response since its inception. There's the DHS functions, which are more broad than the cybersecurity, which has included FEMA, the Use of the Defense Production Act. But then CISA, our cybersecurity specific agency, has been closely involved throughout, starting with the PPE suppliers and manufacturers, and then all the way up now to the vaccine research and production. So we've taken cybersecurity as a top priority as part of the pandemic response because it may go without saying, but the ability to disrupt a vaccine supply chain can have life and death consequences. Obviously, that's not simply the production facilities, but I think as we've seen lately, that's also the cold chain storage and the cold chain distribution network. I'm sure folks may be familiar with the recent reporting on the cold chain phishing and spear phishing campaigns. I don't know that the motivations of those attacks are clear yet, but there does appear to be some involvement by nation states, which is particularly concerning. But even if it was criminals seeking to extract some sort of financial gain, they could leverage the criticality of those particular supply chains and those particular products that we are trying to distribute at record pace. I mean, truly, in a way that is unprecedented for the way the federal government has been cooperating with the private sector. But all it takes is the shutting down or just the slowing of those processes, and there ultimately could be hundreds, if not thousands, of people would die as a result. So it's a very real concern. And the way we've been approaching that is by leveraging our relationships with the private sector. I would be curious to hear if any of the other panelists here or you, Travis, have had experience working with CISA in particular. But I think one of the benefits they really add is they have a lot of information. They have a lot of tools they offer. But I think what they do better than a lot of government agencies, and I think we may come to this later when we talk about CISA and why they're different and what it is they do, is they really do proactive outreach and seek to establish relationships. So I've been a part of the incremental process of identifying each new time a new industry sector has become one of the key potential targets for cybersecurity or other potential disruptions, how we go about doing outreach. And obviously CISA has its own excellent outreach office to do that, but it comes with a lot of unique issues and challenges, and each industry operates differently. But CISA is really the pro when it comes to the U.S. federal government approaching the private sector, state and local governments, the healthcare sector, and saying, here, we'd like to talk with you. We'd like to offer you information on best practices. We'd like to offer information all the way from your C-suite down to your information security specialists. And if you go peruse their website, you can find that they offer some really targeted, very specific information. I'm just going to take the cold chain storage, for example. I know they've released like a series of alerts that, some of them are all the way down to how the systems for those particular distribution systems should be checking to make sure that they are not more vulnerable. But then they've also got advice for C-suite executives in the cold chain, so they understand why, in particular, their companies might actually be a target. So our focus has very much been on understanding what the upcoming threats have been. And I think most folks are familiar here. First, it was medical supplies and PPE. Then it's been the development of a vaccine and testing and making sure that the various networks and distribution networks that are used to push those out are adequately covered. And our job is not to actually go hands-on keyboard and protect anybody's systems or computers, but we actually offer a variety of free services, which I'll gladly talk about later. I'll turn it over to others if they have other thoughts about this. But I would also just say that this is one area where we've seen a lot of coordination as well, both within DHS and CISA, as well as the FBI. We've done a series of joint alerts, but we've also worked extensively with our international partners because this has been a very international operation. We obviously think a lot about the pandemic response here in the United States, but we've worked very closely with Canada, the UK, our European counterparts. And, I could point you to the CISA website again, because I think we've released a lot of good joint products with them. And I guess the one other thing I would say, and this is always true, and I think we've seen this, since the WannaCry attacks several years ago, but we've been very focused on the public healthcare sector as well. Because it's more obvious why a disruption to their systems could have life and death consequences. But we've seen nation states use ransomware in the past to target that sector because it's critical, even in years that aren't a pandemic, but especially now when obviously hospitals are crowded and every single hospital and every single medical facility is being used. So I think we've provided a lot of good information for those as well in years past, but then we've updated them for COVID. And actually, I think CIS and the FBI just did a really good joint advisory on ransomware specifically for those. But I guess I would turn it over to the others to see if they have anything else to offer from their perspective.
I'd just like to reiterate what you just said, Ian, about the proactive benefits of CISA, doing the public outreach. At Ankura several months ago, we were helping a client, which was a research hospital who was actually conducting research on the COVID vaccine. And they were targeted by a cyber espionage group out of the Middle East, specifically we felt for COVID vaccine related data and research. Over the course of our investigation, we were able to extract indicators of compromise as a result of the breach. And we actually were introduced to a member of CISA who was extremely interested in some of the indicators that we had extracted, wanted to learn, more about our investigation. The CISA individual, collected that intelligence and then presumably, shared that intelligence out with other research hospitals that were more than likely being targeted for the exact same type of data. So great collaboration, great outreach, great resource for proactive intelligence.
I think it's very interesting, Ian, to think about the life cycle that you highlighted of how, attacks are directed during the pandemic at the different aspects that we were going through at that time. So maybe it was PPP, or PPE, PPE, then move on to the vaccine, research, then to the distribution. It almost leads you to ask the question, well, what next? Right? Is it an attack on the appointment or reservation system to actually get a vaccine? Right? Is it whether that's done by a county public health organization or whether it's done by private sector companies like Eventbrite or others? You kind of wonder what's next because it's highly doubtful that it just goes away there, but that it's almost certainly persistent with us. And
yeah.
Go ahead, Ian.
No, I was going to say I completely agree, Travis, and I would just add, the undercurrent in all of this is many of these critical functions that have been rolled out during the pandemic have also increasingly relied on some form of virtual productivity. So the ability of these cold chain storage and distribution networks to function, there are obviously human beings that go to a place and do a thing, and those are less subject. It's not free from risk, obviously, but those are less subject to cyber attack to disrupt. But the various people that monitor and manage all of those various systems are obviously doing so in an increasingly virtual workspace, and so what's interesting is the outgrowth of the reliance of virtual workspaces and just virtual productivity has created a whole nother issue, which really is not sector or industry specific, but it's creating a new way to think about. And again, I'm going to plug CISA because I'm here, but it's one area where CISA and others, have come out with a variety of valuable products. Again, from everywhere from C-suite to just help any company think about how they should be thinking about this new virtual office or virtual learning or virtual communication workspace, and then really thinking about how that affects them. Because I think while the obvious targets are the ones who are involved directly, I think the reliance on virtual and the reliance on our internet connectivity to do things and having systems that are being that are being increasingly connected virtually has led to a whole host of new potential targets. So I just would add that piece in there as well.
Yeah, good point, Ian. And look, that applies not just to the private sector, applies to the public sector. Numerous government employees are working virtually right now, and the question will be, how do we manage those risks? To bring us back to ransomware, though, just for a minute, the potential for ransomware attacks on the November election was front of mind in many last year, but we actually didn't see that much activity outside of limited incidents, such as a Georgia County's election signature database being frozen by an attacker back in October, I think. Looking at the potential for election-related ransomware attacks did highlight, however, how vulnerable our state and local governments are to ransomware attacks. One recent article estimated that municipal governments were subject to 45% of reported ransomware attacks in the past 12 months, compared to just 14% of attacks targeting corporations. What are some of the unique challenges that state and local governments are facing with ransomware attacks? How are they responding? And in what ways could you see these attacks impacting the private sector? And maybe, Brandon, we can have you start, but I'm sure Ian will probably have some insights here as well.
Sure. Thanks, Travis. I'll kick it off. In terms of unique challenges that state and local municipalities are facing from ransomware attacks, a lot of these threat groups are opportunistic in nature, meaning that they have dedicated individuals and teams, constantly scouring the internet looking for potentially vulnerable targets. But at the end of the day, this is a business. These threat actors and threat groups are looking to get paid. So constantly looking for targets and victims that offer the highest return on investment, a lot of times leads them to, choosing and targeting local and state municipalities, especially the smaller municipalities. The reason for that is, these municipalities are responsible, number one, for providing critical infrastructure. So 911 response systems, hospitals, education, K through 12, and then some local universities as well. Voting information. We could go down the list, allowing citizens and constituents to pay utility bills. So if these systems went down, that would obviously be a huge problem for these municipalities and also for the constituents. So when you look at how ransomware has evolved, and essentially how it works, the first stage nowadays is usually the threat actor will gain access to an environment and they will exfiltrate data. They're going to look for data that they feel is sensitive. They're going to look for data that has the highest return on impact to the victim. Once they have extracted or exfiltrated enough data, then they'll move on to the encryption phase. When the encryption phase has begun, a lot of times the victims are essentially locked out of certain segments of their network, perhaps even their entire network. So if you think of a municipality, all of a sudden that their 911 system went down. There have been recent instances where threat actors have gained access to a network and they've been there for weeks, if not months, and then they'll wait for a very specific time to launch the encryption phase. One of the more recent events that we've observed was that a ransomware group was able to infiltrate a local municipality school network, and then they waited for the first day of school to actually launch the encryption phase of that attack. So now you've got kids going back to school remotely. You've got teachers that are trying to teach classes remotely, and all of a sudden the entire network is down. Laptops are encrypted, email communications went down. So, a local municipality that is going through a ransomware event is more likely to pay, I guess, at the end of the day. When we think in terms of the exfiltration of data, a lot of local and state municipalities maintain a great deal of sensitive data for their constituents. When you think of voting records, you think of PII, social security numbers, vital records, right? Birth certificates, death certificates, things of that nature. We already spoke about municipalities allowing constituents to pay utility bills. So a lot of times these municipalities will have saved credit card numbers, and things of that nature. So if this data is exfiltrated, I've read a lot about some municipalities that almost believe that it is their responsibility to pay the ransom in order to protect this data from being leaked or dumped on the dark web at the end of the day. How are they responding? I guess the good news is that a lot of these municipalities do have cyber insurance, right? So that there is the option for the insurance carrier to in fact pay the ransom. For those that don't have insurance, a lot of times it's a lot cheaper to pay the ransom than it is to go through the incident response and the remediation efforts. One event that I can think of was the breach of the city of Baltimore last year, where at the end of the day, the ransom was about $600,000. The city of Baltimore decided not to pay it. And then once all of the bills were tallied up for incident response and remediation, you were upwards of $15 million. So the cost of paying a ransom is usually a lot cheaper than going through the remediation efforts. The bad news is that these threat groups know this, right? So they know that a lot of these municipalities, they are responsible for providing key critical infrastructure. They hold a lot of sensitive data. Most of them have insurance. So they are viable targets, right? If you put enough pressure on them, eventually they're going to pay because they rely on these systems, they rely on the data, and at the end of the day, the taxpayers want to make sure that their tax money isn't going to particularly paying a ransom, rather than having the insurance in place.
Brandon, really interesting to hear you detail the kinds of cost factors that go into the decision making at the local and municipal level that maybe on the corporate side or the private sector side we don't see as much in terms of fiscal responsibility and the use of taxpayer dollars. And maybe that is that honeypot, or the potential for that honeypot is what is indeed increasing the target on municipalities and locals.
You had just mentioned budget, Travis. A lot of times it's extremely tough for a municipality to recruit or acquire cyber talent, right? So, typically you would need somebody in-house to make sure that patching is in place, that risk assessments are happening, that employees are being educated, not to open this type of email. If you get a suspicious email, what to do with it. If you are experiencing any type of suspicious activity, how do you handle that? And a lot of times these municipalities, due to budget constraints, they just can't hire top tier cyber talent. When we think of municipalities trying to mature their cyber defense, a lot of times, unfortunately, those steps don't fit within the budgets either. So, there's a lot of impact there as well.
Yeah. Over the years, we've certainly seen that when there are attacks on the private sector, it has evolved to the point where if it's really bad, the CEO, the chairman of the board, people in leadership lose their jobs.
Right.
I think it's only a matter of time, and probably not that far out, before we actually see elected officials finding themselves in similar scenarios when a massive attack takes place and it shuts down services. So, I think it's good to hear you highlight the issues that are there, and for us to bring some attention to this sector. We'll flip back to the federal government just for a minute here. CISA is the federal government, I should add, has greatly expanded its programs to assist companies with responding to national security related ransomware attacks and to collect information about those attacks. The Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency, also known as CISA, is at the center of the government's protective response to ransomware. What is CISA and what's the agency's role in addressing ransomware? Ian, many of us who work in this space regularly know that, but I'm sure there are many in the audience that are learning a little bit about CISA today.
Yeah, well, listen, I love being a shill for CISA, so I'm happy to give my elevator pitch for them right now, and hopefully it's informative to some folks. So yeah, as you said, CISA is, I mean, it's the nation's, risk management agency, which is effectively what we call it. It's been around since 2018. It was spun out of DHS. It used to be a headquarters office, but it's unique because it's non-regulatory, it's non-enforcement, and its focus is truly on information sharing and helping both federal, non-federal government, and private sector. So it has three main missions. It's the cybersecurity mission of CISA, which is what we're going to be talking about today. But then it also has a pretty large critical infrastructure mission, which often overlaps with the cybersecurity mission. And then less known is they also have an emergency communications mission, which is, again, there's a lot of overlaps. And when you talk about things like emergency 911 services, CISA is very involved in that space. I think one way to talk about CISA would be kind of to give an example playing off of what Brandon was just talking about with state and locals. CISA offers a lot of good information. I think sometimes, the lack of information out there might be due to lack of resources, or it's just, a lack of knowledge, or you don't know where to look. CISA has really worked hard in its cybersecurity offerings to focus on information sharing. So they offer things like guides. In fact, there's a very excellent ransomware guide if the folks on this call have not looked for it. Now, there's a lot of ransomware resources. So if you use the Googles, I'm not sure if it'll be the first thing that comes up, but I'm almost certain if you go to the CISA website, you'll find it front and center on their ransomware page. But they also will do alerts for more specific threats. And on ransomware, they push these alerts out to their partners, and in particular in the state and local governments. They have very good relationships with their partners. And they also have CISA for the federal government.com systems. They have a system called the Einstein system, which monitors traffic at the perimeter. And what it does is it detects various types of activity. And from that, sometimes we'll get different alerts and indicators. And it has an automated indicator sharing system where state and locals, private companies can sign up for. And this is all part of CISA's, again, their information sharing function. So if you're a state and local government, there's a lot of free things that CISA can offer you in terms of information to help you achieve baseline cyber hygiene, or if you're dealing with particular threats like ransomware, or you have the capacity to plug into their automated indicator sharing feed, you can get that information. And honestly, I think that goes a long way to starting out any company or local government's journey towards cyber maturity and at least hardening and resiliency. So the second thing they do in their cyber toolbox that's significant is they actually offer cyber hygiene services. So that can be anything from doing scanning, testing, sending out red teams. I think recently it was over 30,000 scanning and testing reports were done in 6 months by CISA. So they offer the service both to the federal government and to state and locals and to the private sector. And then I think one of the services they offer now that's at top of mind for a lot of individuals is their hunt and incident response services. So again, these are all services they offer. The information sharing is available to everyone. The cyber hygiene scanning and testing, it's available for free, but it's available on an as-needed basis. So CISA basically will triage based on what the greatest security risks are, because they have a limited number of teams. And some of it they can do remotely, and I think there's far greater offerings there. But then when it comes to the hunt and incident response, they will send mobile teams, or they will allow people to come to their headquarters where they have some really unique spaces to work with private sector, state and local, and other federal agencies to go through incident response activities. I think, it may be something we talk about later, but they are also very much involved in all of these same activities within the federal government. In particular, CISA is responsible for protecting the .gov for the federal civilian government. They're also one of the lead agencies for coordinating cyber incident response. So CISA has a really interesting mission because it's both internally focused on the USG and externally focused at all times. But I think with all of that, a a state and local government that is looking for tools to get started to make sure that it doesn't become the next parish in Louisiana or Baltimore that finds themselves constantly being attacked by ransomware malware, would do well to start with CISA. And then I'll just use the election as another example of where the federal government's role, and in particular CISA's role, comes into play to really partner, because election security is ultimately a responsibility of the states that manage their own elections. And our election systems have improved dramatically to the point where the 2020 election was remarkably secure. It's not that our adversaries had any less interest in disrupting our elections, but CISA has poured a remarkable amount of resources, and the resources it poured were into doing things as significant as installing sensors on the election systems in all 50 states to help monitor for potential compromises. But then also, they've worked proactively with the secretaries of state and the election infrastructure in each state to provide that information, those hygiene tools and hunt incident response tools, which help those states get their election infrastructure, and the political parties as well, to get their election infrastructure into, frankly, the best shape I think it could have ever been in. I think the flip side of that is that took a lot of time and a lot of resources to be able to achieve that for the state election systems. And it's for good reason, because those are truly one of the most fundamental and critical components of our democracy. But it's not the solution that's going to fit for every state and local municipality. So this is where I think CISA's approach of having this gradated approach of information to testing to more targeted, on the ground, hands-on keyboard assistance, which really ranges from the level of threat, the criticality of the particular stakeholder, is a really good method for dealing with it, and it works well within the rubric of their authority and what their mission is. I would just say real quickly, the other thing too, I think a lot of people wonder about with CISA, because they come off as being a very cool organization to work with as compared to maybe the stuffier old organizations. And I'm not going to name them here because they might be listening in, and I'm friends with the folks at some of those other organizations. But, one of the things that they have to sell in many ways is that they take information security incredibly seriously. Honestly, they have to share information. They get threat indicators from other private sector and government partners. They share those out, but they do it in such a way that when they get information, they strip out all information that would have any privacy or confidentiality implications. They actually, by statute, have to have a privacy officer review almost all of their sharing procedures. They do privacy scrubs before they share anything with the federal government. And we would never report anything to your other regulators either, be they state, local, or federal government. So I think one of the things that CISA does to really facilitate information sharing in a way that is much needed, when we're talking about the resources the federal government can bring to bear and the coordination can bring to bear, is it provides that peace of mind. So that's my elevator pitch, but I'm also happy to talk anymore.
Thank you, Ian. I think we had one question from Greg, which I think you kind of answered, is whether or not CISA is exempt from FOIA. A lot of people always get nervous about sharing information with the government. And I certainly saw an article last week about how other components within the federal government were seeking to gain access to information about solar winds. And so there's, can you speak just very briefly, we're almost to the end here, about the extent to which the information that is shared by the private sector with CISA could be publicly released and or ultimately shared with other components of the federal government without redactions?
Yeah, so as to public release, I mean, CISA is not FOIA exempt. However, when they work with their stakeholders, they're very careful, and everybody's very aware of the concerns over the confidentiality of information. And very often some of the information that's shared itself may be FOIA exempt. But as to the federal government sharing, again, they don't share information across the federal government before they've done a privacy scrub. And they only include information that may be private, confidential, PII from their private sector partners when sharing across the federal government if it's essential to be able to communicate the particular threat. So if they're sharing threat information across the government that they've detected, which requires them to perhaps share the identity of the company or the government that disclosed, they will share that, but they otherwise will scrub out all of that information when they're sharing across the federal government.
Thank you, Ian. I'm seeing that Bruce is donned us with his presence, so I want to make sure to thank the panel. This is our signal that we're bringing this to the end, and thank you all for participating through this session on ransomware and national security.
Thank you, Travis. Great job. That's our last panel for the day. Thanks to the entire panel for bringing us home with such a great ending, and we really appreciate everybody's time and thoughts, so thanks. Before we go, I just wanted to say a couple quick thank yous. First of all, thanks to John Stark, who's been our master of ceremonies here today and has been, as always, an invaluable partner in organizing today's event from start to finish. I think John has outdone himself today, so thank you, John. Thanks also to everyone at Kroll for, again, being our lead sponsor. I'd also like to acknowledge our friends from Ankura, CrowdStrike, Crypsis, FTI, Resilient, Sard Verbinnen, SpearTip, Stone Turn, and John Reed Starr Consulting for joining us today. And as also the law firm Oric, our lead law firm sponsor, and the 12 terrific law firms that were represented here today as sponsors and supporters of the event. Really appreciate that. Finally, thanks to everybody for being here today, joining us as attendees at this event. I hope we will see you at a future event, and thank you.